Oop. Robert, would you like me to just get started?
We're surprisingly on time, so only a few minutes past your session start. Assuming Lucy is on with us, just let me double check that.
Yes, I am.
Okay, great. Then take it away, Kath.
Great, thanks. So welcome to the second session on making Primero accessible and inclusive. My name's Katherine Williamson, and I'm the Save the Children representative on the CPIMS Plus steering committee, and also temporarily covering on the Primero board. And I've been working with CPIMS in its old iteration since 2006, when it was first introduced in South Sudan, and then later in Uganda as well. And currently, Save the Children's using it in 8 humanitarian contexts, with plans for rollout in 3 more. So why the focus on accessibility and inclusion? And yesterday, UNICEF launched a report called Seen, Counted and Included, which highlighted that there are 240 million children around the world who have some form of disability, and that those children are significantly more likely to experience discrimination, corporal punishment and distress. And then in humanitarian contexts where I work, and many of us work, children with disabilities are significantly and visibly impacted by complex and compounding protection risks. And we all need to do our best to step up to meet those needs and support them and their families and communities to meet those needs. And this requires enabling people with disabilities to be able to join the social service workforce, and ensuring that the tools that we use, like Primero, are as accessible as possible. And it also involves ensuring that Primero is as sensitive to the needs of people with disabilities who we work with as possible as well. And Save the Children later this month will be launching our new disability inclusion policy, which outlines commitments in partnership, advocacy and programming. So we will soon be committed to ensuring that our child protection case management is disability inclusive. So I'd ask you all to hold us to account for that. So this session, we've got an hour, and we will have a 40-minute presentation and followed by 15 minutes questions and answers. So I'll hand over soon to Lucy Richardson, just to introduce her. She's a child protection specialist with UNICEF, based in UNICEF headquarters. And she's working specifically on disability and inclusion, and brilliantly, she's an expert on software accessibility as well. So I'm hoping this will be a really informative session. The objectives of the session are to understand key concepts related to accessibility and inclusion, understand the implications of those for users, look at the Washington Group disability classifications, and review new Primero features and think about what else is in the pipeline for accessibility and inclusion. And I will now hand over to Lucy. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes, great. So I will be sharing a presentation with you all today. Just one moment. Here we go. Okay. So as Kath said, I'll be doing my presentation on inclusion and accessibility, so making Primero inclusive of and accessible to persons with disabilities. I'll go over some key concepts related to disability, accessibility and inclusion. I'll talk about the Washington Group on disability statistics and their work, the implications of all of these concepts for users of Primero, and I'll also look at the some improvements that have already been done to Primero and talk about some things that we can do in the future. So I'm using a PowerPoint for this session, but for accessibility purposes, I will be describing what is on the screen, and if anybody would like a copy afterwards, I can also provide that. So this is the cover screen of the presentation. On the left, it's got the title that I just read out, my name, and the name of the meeting, and the photo is of a young woman wearing a headscarf, and you can see her crutches in the background next to her. So a bit more about me. As Kath said, I'm the Child Protection Specialist in Disability Inclusion. So I am placed in the Child Protection System Strengthening Unit within the Child Protection team at UNICEF New York headquarters. So I work across all thematic areas of the child protection portfolio, supporting guidance, policies, tools, anything that can strengthen disability inclusion across our child protection work. And I'm specifically supporting some of this work on the newer iterations of Primero, and so supporting the accessibility and inclusion for that. And a bit more about my background is that before I came to UNICEF, I worked on and off for UNDP, so I've been involved in the UN system for a while. I also worked for International Disability Alliance, and before that I was in direct service provision, child protection, family support. So I do have my own experience with case management systems. I'm a person with a disability myself, and I use adaptive and accessible technologies, techniques, and equipment. So, for example, I am a wheelchair user. I use voice-to-text software, and I use ergonomic, specially designed keyboard, mouse, that kind of thing. So I will be, of course, using my professional knowledge and expertise for this session, as well as some of my personal experience with accessibility too. So I'll move to the next slide now, and this is a slide with text on it, which I will read out. The thing with disability is that it is a very evolving concept, and it can be understood differently across cultures, societies, and time periods. UNICEF uses the description included in the CRPD, which is the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And that's the International Human Rights Treaty for all persons with disabilities, adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2006. And what the CRPD says, and the text that I have on the screen now, is that persons with disabilities include those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments, which, in interaction with various barriers, may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. So the first thing to notice there is it says include, so this is not the be-all, end-all definition. It leaves it open for future understandings of disability. And I have highlighted in a different colour some the particularly important words here, which are impairments, barriers, and participation. So when we say impairments, that can be things like a physical impairment, for example, someone who has cerebral palsy or a spinal cord injury. It could be intellectual, which might be something like Down syndrome. It could be sensory, so a person who is blind or a person who is deaf. But the important thing isn't so much the impairment itself or the condition or the diagnosis. What's important is the functioning that is related to that impairment. So, for example, a person who has a spinal cord injury would have difficulty moving their legs. And the functioning aspect of that is that they're not able to walk or stand or climb stairs. They may need to use a wheelchair. They might have difficulty moving their arms. So self-care like dressing or feeding themselves is difficult. So looking at the functioning, those are the things that we want to be thinking about. The barriers, those can be attitudinal, communication, environment, social. So a common barrier, if we use the wheelchair user example again, would be a building that is not physically accessible. It doesn't have a ramp. Communication would be a video that doesn't have captions or an image that doesn't have alt text to describe what's in the photo. Social and political, so policies and legislations. Attitudinal is one of the most difficult barriers to deal with. So that's things like stigma, discrimination, stereotypes. So the next part of the definition was participation. And participation means that you can be involved in the environment, the process, or the activity equally with others. So concrete examples of this would be living in the community, taking public transport, using a website, using an app. consuming media, using services, having a job, studying, going to school. It's also the feeling and experience of being included, respected, welcome, and involved. So on this next slide, we have a group of children at a school playground, and off to the left of the frame is a boy in a wheelchair being pushed by his friend down a ramp. This picture is from Burkina Faso, and you can see the UNICEF logo in the background of the photo as well. So this concept that I'm talking about, where we look at impairments, barriers, participation, that's what's called the social model of disability. So the emphasis is on the barriers in the environment rather than the person themselves and whatever impairment they may have. It also emphasizes human rights, so that persons with disabilities have the right to participate and be included in society just like everyone else. So this is the model of disability that UNICEF and other UN entities would use. There are some more outdated models of looking at disability, of thinking about disability, and that would be the medical model, which really emphasizes the impairment itself, and the charity model, which portrays persons with disabilities as helpless and objects of pity. So using an example similar to this photo, we have a child who is using a wheelchair attending school. Now, if this particular school had stairs to enter, he would not be able to enter the building. The charity model, looking at this situation, would pity the child and their unfortunate circumstances of being different to their peers, and it doesn't recognise that they have the right to education. The medical model would say we need to try and find a cure for this child's physical impairment so that they can be the same as their peers in functioning and fit into the existing environment. Whereas the social model says that we need to build the ramp so that the child can access the school building because the child has the right to education just like their peers. So on our next slide, we have a young girl at a refugee camp in Bangladesh using a disability-friendly bathroom. And so the next concept I'll talk about is accessibility. And accessibility is when we are addressing those barriers. So it means that persons with disabilities are accessing on an equal basis with others physical environments, transportation, information and communications, facilities and services. And once again, that definition comes from the CRPD. So in the example that we just had of the child at school, yes, we need to build a ramp so the child can get into the school building, but they might need other barriers addressed as well. They might need a larger bathroom. They might need a desk that's a different height. They might need a school bus that has a lift so that they can get on. Now, often people think accessibility is time consuming, it's expensive, you need specialist equipment, you need specialist expertise. That's not always the case. There are some things that do need specialist equipment, that do need funding, but things like flexible working hours or changing the size or colour of text in a document or in an application, those are very easy, low-cost methods, and they are accessibility measures. The other thing is that accessibility measures for persons with disabilities often end up helping everyone. So in our example of the child attending school, if we put the ramp in for the school building, a teacher who has a whole lot of heavy equipment on a cart is also assisted because they can push the cart up the ramp and it makes it easier for them. So we actually call this the curb cut effect. And the curb cuts, I mean, they're called different things in different places, but the little ramp at the end of a sidewalk that lets you get down onto the street, those were initially put in for wheelchair users, but a lot of people benefit and use those. So that's people with shopping carts, people with luggage, parents with strollers, kids on scooters. Everyone gets to benefit. A couple of other well-known curb cut effect things were Alexa and Siri and similar systems like that. Those were originally invented for persons with disabilities. Even things like remote controls, originally invented for persons with disabilities, but now everybody gets to benefit. The most important thing to remember is that accessibility is the precondition for everything else. You can't have a seat at the table if you can't get to the table in the first place. Now, our next slide has another text definition, which I will read out now. And it says, the design of products, environments, programs and services to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. Now that's the CRPD definition of universal design. So this idea of designing for everyone, so everyone can benefit, that's universal design. So in our example of the child attending school, the universal design would be to have all of these accessibility measures in place from the beginning and so that many children and adults at the school can benefit. On our next slide, we've got a picture of a young woman using a cane, a white cane, because she's blind, and she's with some friends. They're all in school uniform. They're laughing and talking and walking together. So I think this is a good representation of inclusion. So this links with participation, and it's the idea that people are welcomed, their voices are heard, they can contribute equally with others. So in our previous example, the child going into a school, it's not just about physically accessing the school's building, but it's that their ideas are heard in class discussions. They're welcomed by their peers and their school community. They can use the textbooks. They can join in on games on the playground. They're not in segregated facilities, ignored or excluded or overlooked. So accessibility and universal design are what help us achieve participation and inclusion. Concept I'm going to go over is related to the Washington Group on Disability Statistics. Now, the image I have up on the screen now is a screenshot of one of the set of questions that was developed by this group to help collect data on disability. So the Washington Group on Disability Statistics, they started developing ways so that we could, and by we, I mean anyone, could collect accurate and comparable data on disability. Because one of the really big problems is that we don't have, when you don't have the data and the information, then it's very difficult to ensure that people's rights are upheld, to ensure that they can access services and products and all of this. So they originally developed a short set of questions aimed at adults, and the idea of the questions was to record difficulties with functioning that may put a person at risk of limited or restricted participation. So thinking back to the concept that we covered of talking about function rather than the impairment itself and how that impacts someone's ability to participate. That's what the Washington Group is getting at. Now, with the questions that they use, they don't actually use the word disability. So they don't ask questions like, do you have a disability? This is because, like I said at the start, disability changes according to somebody's idea of disability changes according to their background, to their society, to their community. Sometimes there's a lot of stigma and discrimination, so people might not want to say that they or their child has a disability. And again, it's saying that someone has a disability in and of itself doesn't really tell you a lot. You need to know about functioning. So that was the original short set was aimed at adults. But of course, this isn't necessarily relevant to children due to changes in functioning due to typical development, and it's also quite different according to the age of the child. So in collaboration with UNICEF, another 2 sets of questions were developed, one for children aged 2 to 4 and one for children aged 5 to 17. So this screenshot that I have on the slide right now covers questions related to mobility. So the domain, we call it the domains of functioning. So the domains of functioning for adults is seeing, hearing, walking and climbing steps, remembering and concentrating, self-care and communication. For children aged 2 to 4, we have vision, hearing, mobility, communication and comprehension, behaviour and learning, dexterity and playing. For children aged 5 to 17, we have the same as for the younger children, but we take out dexterity and playing and we add self-care, remembering, focusing attention, coping with change, relationships, and emotions. So the domains of functioning were chosen because they are basic, they're universal, they're common to all countries and cultures, and evidence has shown that these concepts are recognised across multiple different languages and cultural backgrounds. So in this screenshot that we have here, it is the mobility questions. So we can see the first question says, does name use any equipment or receive assistance for walking? So the person that is carrying out the survey or asking the question of the parent of a child would read out, does this person use any equipment or receive assistance for walking? The first answer has yes or no. So if it's no, you can skip to the next set of questions, which would be on communication and comprehension. But if they do use equipment like crutches or wheelchairs, then we've got a couple of questions here, and it asks about difficulty walking, and the answers are, rather than a simple yes or no, it's categorizing the level of difficulty. You've got some difficulty, a lot of difficulty, or cannot do it all. And the next question says, with his or her equipment or assistance, do they have difficulty walking? The answers you can give: no difficulty, some difficulty, a lot of difficulty, cannot do it all. So this is very helpful because people's functioning is often not a simple yes or no. It is more a graded kind of concept. So the way that the Washington Group questions have been designed is really, as we said, closely linked to this idea of functioning. It doesn't really matter what a particular child's diagnosis is. It matters how that affects their functioning and how that affects their participation in general life. So the next part that I'm going to go to is talking about what all of this means for Primero, what the implications are for the design and development of Primero and for the people who are using Primero in their work. So this slide depicts a adolescent girl who is blind. The picture on the left, you can see that she's holding her cane and she's holding a phone up close to her ear. And there is also an image of her using Braille. So this is just another good example of accessibility and addressing barriers. And so I want to talk a bit about how these concepts are important to Primero and its users. So firstly, the assumption we make about Primero is, as we know, that it's being used in a variety of different contexts, for a variety of purposes, for a variety of people. Statistically speaking, it is likely that some of the users of Primero and some of the clients will be persons with disabilities. Therefore, we really need to think about barriers, participation, inclusion, accessibility, and universal design, all of these concepts that we just went over. So firstly, what I want to talk about is that what I call the back end or behind the scenes accessibility. There is a technology partner that handles this for Primero. That includes the programming language, the coding, the functioning of the websites and systems and apps themselves, all of the things that are running in the background so that people can do things like, in this image, use a screen reader because the system is coded properly for the screen reader to recognize that. So I won't be going into depth about those technological kind of things, but just know that, of course, we do have that kind of thing in place. So firstly, the benefit of accessibility for Primero, beside the obvious, we want to be accessible, we want everybody to be included, is that accessibility also overlaps with other best practices in the technology world, like mobile web design, device independence, multimodal interaction and usability. Case studies have also shown that accessible systems, apps and websites have reduced maintenance costs, increased audience reach, better search results. So when we're thinking about accessibility for Primero, we want to think about how impairments and functioning may interact with barriers in Primero and what we can address with accessibility measures. So I'm going to go through a few different impairment types, the functioning, what barriers might be present, and then the accessibility measures that we can use. So for example, a physical type of impairment might impact functioning such as dexterity, positioning of hands or fingers, the speed with which you can use your hands, your reach, the ability to apply pressure, fine motor skills, steadiness of hands. Those functioning difficulties, barriers that might come up is when you have a system that requires things like clicking and holding, clicking and dragging, having very small areas to click on a screen like hyperlinks, multi-key functions like a control or delete, that kind of thing, touch screens, whether you can use touch screens or not. So the accessibility measures that would be great for those kind of barriers would be to allow multiple inputs for using a system or an app. So being able to use your keyboard, your mouse, or a touch screen. Having resizing options. So if an area that you need to click on is too small, you can resize it and make it bigger. And having multiple options for navigation. So for example, having a banner at the top, having a menu on the side, having a button that you click that says return to top, that kind of thing. With an impairment that is visual in nature, functioning that is affected might be things like someone might have trouble differentiating between light and dark. Contrast might be difficult. They may have a narrow, restricted or obstructed field of vision. They may have trouble differentiating colours. So barriers that could come up in Primero for them would be the colour of certain features, the contrast, any multimedia that doesn't have alternative text or a caption, text that is too close together or too small or it can't be sized, any interruptions to text such as auto open a new window or auto play a song. When someone's reading a screen reader, a sudden interruption will cause the screen reader to go and follow that automatic function. The captures that you see on websites, sometimes those can be very difficult, and having a cluttered interface, also another barrier. So the accessibility measures we would apply there would be text alternatives for non-text content, having alt text, having captions, having resizing options, again, very important, having multiple options for inputs and outputs, so using keyboard, mouse, touch, having clean, organized interfaces. For impairments related to hearing, someone might have difficulty with differentiating various sounds, with understanding speech, or with environments where there are multiple sounds. So barriers that could come up is, for example, a static volume level that you can't adjust for anything that has sound, autoplay sound, or sound-based notifications. So then the accessibility measures you could apply would be making sure that there are different options for notifications. There are multiple options for inputs and outputs. The last category, these aren't necessarily all related themselves, but some of the accessibility measures and barriers are quite similar. So considering cognitive based impairments, learning, intellectual, psychosocial, or neurodiverse, some of the functioning difficulties could be someone has trouble focusing on extended processes, linking concepts together, remembering information, physical and mental stamina. So the barriers would be if content is moving very quickly and they don't have time to read and absorb it all. If the flow is interrupted, if processes are illogical or complicated, flashing lights or particular sounds can be very difficult for people who have any type of seizure problem where flashing lights can trigger that, or not having an auto-save option if they're not able to complete a task all at once. So the accessibility measures would be having enough time to read and use the content, making sure the content appears and operates in predictable ways, and options that help the user avoid mistakes and correct mistakes, having multiple options for navigation, and having save functions in the system. So applying universal design means that all current and potential users can benefit from these kind of accessibility measures that we're talking about. A really important thing to consider is that some people who would be considered to have a disability, according to what the CRPD tells us, they might not actually identify themselves or recognize in themselves that they have a disability. So when we apply universal design to Primero, it means that we can capture these people, but we also need to think about other groups of people who can benefit. So once again, that curb cut effect. So for example, people who have low levels of comfort with technology, maybe they're generally not very comfortable with computer systems, with apps, they might be unfamiliar, they might be a new user. People who have low literacy levels for whatever reason, specifically in reading, or perhaps it's not their native language that they're using the system in. Learning capabilities and preferences. So everybody's got different approaches to learning and remembering information and retaining information. And ease of use. I mean, I touched on that already, but when you think about it in general, you want to have a system that is easy to use and something that can be easily rolled out, and new or infrequent users don't need to spend a lot of time getting up to speed on how everything works. Also consider temporary impairments like having a sprained wrist, having a headache, being really tired. Situational as well, perhaps someone is outdoors and it's really bright light. Maybe it's a really loud room, maybe there's flickering lights. And then of course technical things like computer capacity, bandwidth, network capabilities, these things. So when we apply universal design, we're ensuring accessibility for persons with disabilities, but for everyone else as well. So our next slide is another photo, and it depicts a group of adults, and some of the adults have children with them, and there is a person leading a discussion. They're all sitting on the ground on a mat. The person's leading the discussion and they're all listening and participating. This photo was taken at a community centre in Bangladesh. So all of these are key concepts that we've gone through, the examples that I've given. Aside from the actual functioning of Primero, we also want to apply it to the use of Primero. So it's not just about users who may have disabilities, it's about the clients that our users may be working with, and those clients may have disabilities themselves. So when we make sure that we have space in the system to talk about and record disability, for example, by using the questions from the Washington group, that helps the worker or the user of the system to create a complete picture of the client and their needs, and recognize the barriers in the environment that may affect the situation that the worker is engaging with them on. So it helps the user recognize that some risk factors in their client situation may be created or exacerbated by barriers in the environment rather than the person's impairment or disability itself. And that means that our users are empowered to provide services to their clients in disability sensitive and informed ways. It ensures that persons with disabilities are included in service provision. So to give an example from the child protection space, let's say that we have a client who has not attended the recommended parenting class, and the parenting class looks a bit like the one in the photo that we have here, where we have a facilitator speaking to a group of parents, and behind them they have a chalkboard that they are displaying information on. So the client never directly said to our worker that they have a disability. However, if you use the Washington Group questions that talk about functioning, that would reveal that the person has, in our example, low vision. So they have difficulty seeing something on a board, and so they need to have written materials provided to them in large print. So applying the social model in this scenario means that rather than saying this parent isn't interested in attending the classes, they're not interested in dealing with the situation at hand, we recognise that there is a barrier, which is the communication method. And we could arrange for the information being written on the board to instead be provided in a large format, print format to the client, which means the client can now participate in the class and learn the needed skills. The next few slides that I'm going to look at are screenshots and comparisons from Primero itself, and we'll start with the older version and then move to a newer version. So I will give, I'll give a minute so that people can look at the screenshot that we're putting up. So this screenshot is the old version. Some of the things that I will point out on this slide is, as I said, it is a screenshot. On the left-hand side of the screen, we have a navigation menu. Includes things like home, tasks, cases, tracing request. In the center, we have two boxes. One is an overview of cases, and one is a workflow. And then on the right-hand side, we have flagged cases, which has a list of names, dates, etc. So this is an older version of what Primero might look like. So think about some of the accessibility things that we talked about: font, layout, color, etc. So we'll go to the newer version, and likely you can already see a difference. I'm going to talk about some of the features that really are great for accessibility. So firstly, we can see that in the center here, these boxes are a bit more clearly defined. They kind of pop out from the background. The information in the overview section, the columns are separated by a line in the middle. They didn't have that in the old version. The numbers are in a different color to the rest of the text, so it helps it stand out, and you look at it and go, that's a number. That's what I need to look at. The headings are in a different color as well, and we'll see that they've added something here on things that are urgent, and something on more info on the My Cases section. So this part here, My Cases, we've got some more information there. So this, pointing out some of the really important stuff here, is really helpful, say for someone who has something like ADHD and may have trouble focusing and picking out the most important information. The information is now presented in a way where it is really clear what is most important. I'll also note that we've got some headings in caps on the side here with some flagged cases. You can see down the bottom it says see all 4, so you know if you've got more cases. And down the bottom here under work, once again, we have different colors for the numbers. I'm going to switch back to the old version again, just so we can compare it again quickly. So old version. The next screenshot that I'll look at. Once again, we have an old version. This is specifically looking at a case. So have a look at this similar kind of layout. We've got a navigation column on the far left. Then next to that overall navigation column, we've got a second navigation column that has a list of things that are available in the case. And then we've got the child's personal details here, cancel and save button at the top right. So this is the older version, and now here we have the newer version. So in this newer version, the same kind of general layout with the navigation on the left, then a second navigation column, and then a space for the case details. But there is, this again is a bit clearer and more easy to navigate. We'll see that under child's details, the space where you can type in information now has a box around it. So it's clear where you can be typing your information. You'll notice that the second box where you can type information is highlighted, and that's just demonstrating that that's the section that we're up to. So if someone's attention is distracted for whatever reason, they can come back and they know where they're up to. You can see that the navigation for the case itself, the headings have been done in bold. There's an arrow to indicate that it drops down, and the section that you're on is highlighted as well. I'm going to compare it again to the older version so we can look again at some of the things that have changed. So here you can see that we didn't have the boxes for people to type in the details, and it wasn't highlighted to show where you were up to. The navigation didn't have the bold headings, and the overall navigation had this transparency in the background here. So bold, new. So this brings me to the end of the presentation that I prepared, but we certainly have time for discussion and conversation and questions. And if there is anything that anyone would like me to go back to and explain again, I would be happy to do that. I'm going to close this presentation now and stop screen sharing. Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. That was fascinating. It was really interesting to hear. Thank you. And I love the way you presented as well. I thought it was great. Does anyone have any questions for Lucy? Feel free to speak out or put them in the chat box or put your hand up, whatever you feel most comfortable doing.
While we wait to see if people are writing their questions, that kind of thing, I did a brief presentation in the Primero internal coordination group for UNICEF, and I gave some examples from my personal experience, which I think would be really helpful to share here. So while people are coming up with their questions, please type them into the chat box, think of what you are going to say. I did briefly mention that I use some assistive and accessible technology myself, but I will go into that in a bit more detail so that you can hear about how different accessibility measures that might not seem obvious at first are actually used. And maybe you can think about, people can think about how that applies to the work that they do. So as you can see, I am using a headset now, but I often use a headset when I'm not presenting because I use speech to text software. My fine motor skills in my right hand are quite affected, and it is difficult for me to type or use a mouse with my right hand. So when I have to do a lot of writing, I'm using voice to text software. I do that on my phone as well. I use voice to text to message people, to write emails, that kind of thing. I also I try to use one hand to use my phone. So something I'm often looking at is what the layout of a mobile application looks like. Am I able to use it one-handed, or does it have a lot of things that I need to be touching and dragging and pulling on the screen? I use an ergonomic mouse. When I do type, I prefer to use a very small keyboard because that's a lot easier to use one-handed. And a really common accessibility requirement for me is that I can't handwrite. So if I am in like a workshop or class of some kind, often they want us to all write on a big piece of paper together. I can't do that. So I usually would take notes on my phone, or I would ask someone else to write that down for me. I like to use those examples because, often people think accessibility measures are really obvious, or they're really big things, or you have to spend a lot of money. I mean, it doesn't cost anything for me to say something to someone and them to write it down for me. Let's see if we have any questions. Use the term assistive technologies. Did you want to elaborate on that at all, Robert? The question about assistive? Yeah.
I think it's just that I get the question frequently, and I'm never totally confident that I'm answering it correctly. So, I mean, it seems like it can be a blanket term for just about anything. So, you mentioned, for example, remote control, or those types of examples. Like I've heard in my work assistive technologies being used to describe just about everything, but I don't know if that's accurate or not, and if there's a way to define it better, if you could share that.
Yeah, assistive technology can cover a lot of things. Often people are using it to talk about really specific kind of high-tech equipment. So for example, the program that I use is called Dragon. It's the speech-to-text software. So the assistive technology is that software that hears my voice and converts it to written text. But it can be things like apps that people use is, for example, there is an app called Be My Eyes, which is for a person who is blind or has low vision, uses the app to get in contact with someone. They use the video on their phone, and the person on the other end describes what's happening in front of them, or what the product is, or whatever. You can have things like, for example, you can get textured silicone bands that you put on the top of bottles, like of medicine, for example, and someone who is blind or low vision would use the different textures to know that this is a tablet. This is a bottle of ibuprofen tablets. This is a bottle of contact lens solution. They use the silicone thing. So that can be assistive technology. I also like to say assistive and adaptive devices. For example, there's like a lot of things in adaptive fashion, for example, and they can be really simple things, like instead of having a tiny zipper, they have a big loop on the end, so someone with limited hand function can easily grab it. Yeah, so it can really cover a whole lot of things is the answer. Just seeing what other questions we have, Kath.
I have something from Marta here. She's suggesting to document the material resources needed to facilitate, and something we can share with country offices.
So often with the country officers, like I know for UNICEF country officers, we have a dedicated reasonable accommodations system that we use, and I think it's often helpful for people to be aware of the kind of things that they can ask for and they can get. Touching again on the idea that there are different understandings of disability, so someone might not necessarily consider themselves to have a disability, even if they do need some sort of assistive or adaptive technology. I think it's always important to remind people that not everything for accessibility necessarily is a big cost investment, or very, takes up a lot of time, or is a huge, big deal. I mean, this mouse is like $20, but it makes a world of a difference. I think someone had their hand raised. Let me see.
Yes, and
Yeah, that
apologies,
was
I
me.
can't see.
Hi, this is Pavel. I'm the tech lead for Primero.
Okay.
So I just put my question in the chat, but kind of an open question. Have we considered having accessibility user acceptance testing for Primero, and what would that look like?
I think, Robert, do you want to answer that one? I mean, first I would say what that would look like is that you would definitely have a range of users with a range of different, functional needs, different accessibility needs. That would be the thing to consider, and to think about as well what I was talking about with not necessarily people who have disabilities, but various situations in which they may need accessibility features. But Robert, perhaps you want to answer anything about accessibility user acceptance testing.
Yeah, it's lovely to be put on the spot. Thank you for that, Pavel. No, what I wanted to share with everyone to answer to Pavel's question, but also one other sort of experience that's important that Lucy's alluded to. So Pavel, a lot of what we've done has been based on what we can afford. And when we started this, I'm just going to quickly try to give credit to Needy, the colleague that we had joined us through the Google Summer of Code initiative, and she took this original project on to essentially scope out what we would have to do, for lack of better language, to make Primero accessible and inclusive. It's a big thing. You can take little bites of it, and it's going to be an ongoing thing. It's not going to be something we accomplish in one go. So to understand the full scope and to basically break it down into parts, there are financial implications, and I consulted with the team here in UNICEF, and they had some LTAs with different companies that did this kind of work and could provide this kind of service, and it was stratospherically expensive. Like, it was really prohibitively expensive. And so when Lucy came on board, we started talking, and one of the revelations I had is that it's not that expensive, that you can actually do quite a bit of work that, like she says, benefits everyone. Because that was my first, and as a product owner, my first question, I'm almost ashamed to say it, but it's like, how many people are going to benefit from this, right? If we put a bunch of energy and time into this, like, how many social workers do we have out there in the field that are going to benefit from it? And this engagement with Lucy's really opened my eyes to the fact that that's not the denominator, right? We're not talking about just a handful of people that are going to benefit. Everybody benefits from it. And it can be done in a very cost-effective way and kind of parsed out into like a project that, this might be a work stream that we work on for years. And to answer your question, I did have a conversation with Lucy about this. We haven't landed on how we do that, but there are professionals that do this. We might be able to crowdsource some of that type of support, but as of now, it's still up in the air on the user testing. Maybe Lucy, you have some ideas about how we could. Lucy herself has volunteered to support that process, but maybe I'll hand it back to you, Lucy, if there's anything
Sure.
you'd like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, what you've said is definitely important, recognizing that even though it does seem really overwhelming at first, it's also important to remember it's not like an all or nothing kind of thing. Sometimes these things, it's bit by bit, step by step, it starts to come along. I have done so much on accessibility walkthroughs and checks. I mean, particularly for physical space as a wheelchair user, it's so easy for me to just literally come into a building and go, that. it's very easy, because if I can't get into the room, or if I can't reach the printer or whatever it is, it's immediately obvious. So some of the kind of really basic stuff, like if you have someone who's using a screen reader, try to use your product and immediately there's a block, then straight away you know already, yeah, there's something that we've got to work on here. I think to really try and break it down into steps and not feel like absolutely everything has to be perfect from right out the gate. And instead, yeah, try to think about it being a progressive realization, and always aiming towards improving things. And yeah, to not feel like everything's got to be immediately happening and absolutely perfect from the start. But yeah, and definitely, you know, consider how many people will find it helpful, even if you might not necessarily think that that's, you know, that's an accessibility feature, or you might not think that's something that people need. Often accessibility measures can be really, like I said, really simple, really easy things to do. Mm-hmm. And
Great. Do we have any other questions from anyone?
I will just put a link in the chat box here, which is, oh, let's see, did that work? I'm not sure if that, yeah, if you click that link, I'm going to try and copy the actual URL. But this is the web accessibility standards website. So I would definitely recommend having a look at that website if you want to learn more about accessibility in web design systems, apps, all of that. It has really useful information broken down into different parts, really easy to read and learn. It's got a series of short videos as well that show how those accessibility measures affect people, and how it makes it easier for them to use a particular online service or product. So I'd really recommend having a look at that. Yeah. And for our UNICEF colleagues, the SharePoint site of the disability team has some good resources there as well.
Fantastic, thanks. I'm definitely going to take that back to Save the Children, make sure that's on the agenda. Thank you, Lucy. That's such an interesting presentation and really thought-provoking, and really useful and practical. Unless there's any other questions, I think that's probably we can wrap the session up. And I think we're going to break next.
Great. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.